This is video number 3 in the Craftsman 150 Rebuild series. If you haven't seen video number 2, click the link at the top of the screen. I'm going to start off this video by covering a couple of things that I missed in the last video. Hello everyone, I'm Jeff and welcome to my shop. So let's get started. Okay, in video number 2 I said I removed the snap ring from the quill using vice grips. So here it is. You just attach the vice grips to each side of the opening on the snap ring and then pull them apart and then lift the snap ring straight up. There you go. That's the same way you're going to install it later on. Next, I'm going to remove the quill bearings just using a 1/2 inch wooden dowel and a hammer, and I'm just going to smack it and the dowel is basically sitting on the inner race of that bearing. And I dropped the dowel, but you can see the bearing starting to come out on the bottom there. And eventually it will come out. There it is. And then I just flip the quill over, and then I can use a larger dowel to knock out the other bearing. Like so. There you go. And next, to remove the spring from the pinion and hub, you've got that splined pin and you use a 1/4 inch punch, and you want to punch it so that the splines are coming out, not going all the way through. And the pin fell, but there's your spring. And then you should be able to twist the hub off of the pinion. So if you recall from video 1, I couldn't get the hub off of there. But after it's soaked in the simple green for 24 hours, I was able to pull it off. And so we're all caught up now. Here's part 3. It's been 24 hours, so we're going to be removing the column from the citric acid solution. So we're just going to lower the column to the ground and pour the citric acid out. Even though I don't have grass over there, it's completely safe. That whole area is usually in shade from my deck, so grass doesn't grow there really well. And there's the column. And we're just going to rinse off the column. And here we are inside. I'm laying a piece of cardboard on the floor, and I've already wiped off the column and dried it off. And now I'm just going to coat the inside of the column with WD-40. And I'm going to let that just sit while we set up for what we're going to be doing for the rest of this video, pretty much. So on the forums, I reference a poor man's lathe and get lots of questions about it, especially for people that don't have lathes, which you can see my metal lathe and my wood lathe in the background there. But for a poor man's lathe, all you need is some casters, a board to mount them on, That's a cheap Harbor Freight drill that I've got there. That's a piece of all thread. Those two wooden table legs or chair legs that I got from Home Depot that are on it, and I drilled out the centers of them so that they can slide on the all thread. So I'm just using some quick clamps to hold the board down that has the casters on it. And I'm gonna, I think it's a 5/16 piece of all thread. And that's just a couple of 2x4s that I screwed together. And I'm going to just screw that 2x4 mixture down to the workbench so that it doesn't rattle away. And this is going to help level the drill with the all thread once the all thread is inside the column. So I've got some foam pieces from just a piece of floor foam mat, and I just set the drill on it. I go ahead and remove the two nuts off the piece of all thread. And take off one of the wooden furniture legs. And then I run the all thread through the column. And then put the furniture leg on the other end. Put a washer on it. And then I'll attach the two nuts. So, and I'm sure there's easier ways to do this. This is just the system that I came up with. And I have another piece of all thread that's longer that I use for the floor standing columns. And then I'll chuck up the all thread in the drill. And then once I've got the drill pretty much in line with the all thread, I've got some 1.5-inch webbing that I will strap down the drill with so that it doesn't go flying away. And then we're just going to tighten those two nuts down on the end so that they're jamming against each other. And then we'll see how we're doing. And it looks like it's rolling pretty good. So now I'm going to put some towels under it So it is spinning, but it's not spinning at a super high rate of speed. It's fast but controllable. Next, I'm going to use the angle grinder with the Scotch-Brite pad on it. So I started spinning. And then I just work from one side all the way to the other and then back with the Scotch-Brite pad. And you can see how clean it gets it right away. And that's about the speed that I'm going to move the whole length of the column. I'm going to try to do it without stopping along the way. It gets kind of tricky when you get to the ends because obviously the Scotch-Brite pad wants to hit those wooden ends that I've got on there. But I'll go all the way in one direction and then I'll come back in the opposite direction. So 2 passes. Then I do the same process for the sandpaper. And I'm not pushing down hard or anything like that. I'm letting the tool do all the work. So get to the end, and then we come back. So at the distance that the camera is looking at it right now, it's actually looking pretty nice, but there's a lot of pitting on this column. So normally what I would do after the Scotch-Brite is I start with the sandpaper, but there was so much pitting on this column that I opted to go with the sanding flap wheels on the angle grinder next. And then I go to the sandpaper. And I'm not going to show, me constantly doing the entire length of the column in both directions for every piece that I do, but you'll get the idea that this is the speed you want to go at and the technique, I guess. And there we are. So you can see here, there's shiny areas on the end down there where my hand is, and then this whole center section is really pitted. And then there's a shiny area right before you get to the casters closest to the camera. So the top of the column is closest to the camera, and that was actually where the bottom bore of the head was sitting on that column. That's why it's not pitted, but the rest of it is really pitted. So now we're putting on one of the sanding flap wheels. And that's a 40 grit. I've got a 40, a 60, and an 80 grit flap wheel, and I'll be using all 3 of them. And so I'm just going to do the same thing I did with the Scotch-Brite wheel. I'll go the whole distance in one direction and then come back in the other direction. But you can see how shiny it's getting just from the flap wheels. And yeah, there are sparks coming off, but it's no big deal. So here is the 60 grit flap wheel. And then the 80 grit. And my dog. And then back to the Scotch-Brite wheel. And so if I have a column that doesn't have a lot of pitting on it, then like I said before, all I do is the Scotch-Brite wheel, and then I start with the sandpaper. So now we're going to use the sandpaper, and I start with an 80 grit. Then I'll go the whole length, and then I'll rotate the sandpaper and come back in the opposite direction. And I'll do this for every piece of sandpaper. And then we go to 100 grit. And then 120. I didn't have any 150, but if I did, I would do the 150 next. And then the 220. So all of this sandpaper has been dry. And I've got all the wet sandpaper soaking in that blue plastic bin that's got water in it right now. So next we're going to wet a rag and wipe down the column. And between each grit of sandpaper, we're going to do this. We're going to wet and wipe down the column. So we're going to the 320 grit wet sandpaper. And I go about a foot. And then we re-wet the sandpaper. And then go another foot, and then wet the sandpaper. Go another foot, and wet the sandpaper. And then do the last foot. And wet the sandpaper. And then we start coming it back in the opposite direction. Rotate the sandpaper and start working our way back. Go a foot and wet the sandpaper. Now, it should go without saying, but you've got to be careful with your hands when you get near the casters. And like I said, it's not spinning at such a high rate of speed that I feel unsafe or anything like that. It's fast but controllable. So the key to wet sanding is to apply the constant pressure and keep wetting the sandpaper. And that was 320, so now we're going to the 400, but we're going to wet and wipe down the column again. And then we go to 400. It's exactly the same. Go a foot, wet the sandpaper. And then we go to 600. Go a foot, wet the sandpaper. And then 800. And then 1000. And now you can see that most of that pitting is gone. Not all of it, but most of it. And we're getting a pretty decent shine on the column. And then we're going to clean off the column. And we're going to dry off the column. So what's going to make this really shine is the Mother's mag and aluminum polish. So I just use a cheap ShamWow thing. I cut them in strips about 3 inches wide and about 10 inches long. And I'm just going to apply the polish over the entire column. And then I get a clean piece of that ShamWow material. And we're going to work it just like we did the sandpaper. We're going to go from one side to the other. And when we get to the end, we're going to fold it in half and come back in the opposite direction. And you can see the shine on that column now. Okay, so that's most of the polishing. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the column. And Then we're going to come back and apply a coat of Johnson's paste wax to the column. And this is just the Johnson's paste wax that's used on floors. Just using a microfiber rag. So we're just coating the entire column with the paste wax, and then we'll come back and buff it by hand. And all the paste wax is going to do is protect it, since it's bare metal, to keep it from rusting. So you need to recoat them about once a year. If you're in an environment that has a lot of humidity, like where I am here in the South. But that's pretty much it. That's how you, or at least that's how I polish my columns. And then I'll just cut a piece of this cardboard, and then we'll stand the column on that cardboard just off to the side, and let it continue to drain some of that WD-40 while we work on the rest of the drill press. So I think that'll wrap up video number 3. I hope you found this enjoyable, and if you did, please like or subscribe, and I will see you next time.